Hey everybody, hope you're having a great week. Let's go ahead and get started. This is week 12, water part 2. So we talked a little bit about wastewater, the importance of water quality. We talked about that last week. Not much is going to really coincide with this week. We're talking about something completely new. So especially whenever it comes to preparation for the quiz or the exam, just make sure to be able to acknowledge that this is new material that we're going to be focusing on. All right, let's go and get started. So the topics that we're going to be covering very briefly: recreational water, septic tanks, and percolation tests, and waste treatment plants, specifically wastewater treatment plants. So very quickly, we're not going to go over too much having to do with the recreational water, but one thing I really want to illustrate is that very similar to the water that we drink, just like we covered last week, recreational water should contain a very limited amount of bacteria. By that, I mean, at, as feasible, none, if possible. For example, even pools that have that utilize chlorine, bacteria can build up, and that's a concern. It's even though we're not actively drinking it or bathing in it, making sure that our recreational water is as clean as possible is also vitally important, because it's not just through ingestion that we could be able to, I guess, be subject to waterborne illness, waterborne disease, and kind of that stagnation. So just keep that in mind. It's an important thing that we're trying to keep the overall quality of our water, not just quality of our water improved high, not just our drinking water. But let's go ahead and get started on some of the really new material, which is percolation tests, or perk tests. Ultimately, the purpose of a perk test is to examine how rapidly water is absorbed into the soil, specifically because that water is going to ultimately run off and into the regular ground and through a septic system. Typically, this is very important if you're looking to be able to build your own house, especially if you're not going to be connecting to regular city or county water supplies or sewage supplies. A percolation test is very important to be able to better understand what kind of soil and what kind of environment is around your house. So, as you may kind of come to realize, there are certain substances that are both good and bad for certain areas. Specifically drainage fields where water will kind of leach into, but we'll get into that a little bit later. So water permeable substances increase the absorption rate, while uh, less permeable substances such as clay, or yeah, really clay is one of the most common ones that we find. Those decrease how well water can be able to absorb into the rest of the soil. So understanding that can be able to help you to know whether or not you're going to pass or fail a perk test. And it is important to be able to understand that a perk test is very important. In fact, if you're, for example, building a house and you build the entire house and it's all there and it's all set up and you forgot to do a perk test, you do a perk test later, an environmentalist comes out and they conduct the perk test or perform the perk test, and it fails, and they move spots to a different area in your land and it fails, and they move to a different area and it fails, and they can't find one. Technically, the government says you can't live there. It's because there's nowhere where that water sewage from the septic tank can be able to actually naturally filter out into the ground around you. It's just going to pool up. That's where we commonly see where septic systems back up and it starts flooding the ground above it. And it makes it very unsanitary because that is wastewater. And so a percolation test is very, very important to be able to understand what is that absorption rate, is it appropriate, and making sure that it's what it needs to be. Don't worry, you don't have to know as far as like how far, how many inches per minute does it needs to go down. And then as well, be sure to read the week 2 drain fields document. It gives just a really clear step-by-step. I believe there's 8 different steps on how to perform a perk test. It's good to be able to just get a frame of reference, especially if you're interested. You don't have to look though. Hint. You do not have to look. That was the hint. Very simply, though, is what you do is kind of like that picture there on the right, is you dig a hole and you fill that hole with water to a certain degree. And using a measuring stick or a yardstick, you time how long it takes that water to recede and to go down, or it's absorbed by the soil itself. If it's too slow, it fails. If it's too fast, it could also fail. Just because we want to time out how fast it goes through the soil so that it has time to naturally filter itself before it gets to the water table. So next, septic versus sewer systems. So no matter where you live, well, at least here in the United States, I'm not very familiar whenever it comes to outside of the United States, how it necessarily works. But our wastewater, it goes somewhere. So septic and sewer systems really differentiate who owns the sewer or the wastewater treatment and kind of where in location these things are. Typically in more rural areas, we have septic tanks, whereas in more city environments, we have sewer systems. Septic tanks, ultimately it's the owner. It's a septic tank, that picture up there in the top right with the two green circles. That's a septic tank. And it's basically a miniature wastewater treatment center that's right in there. And as well as the drainage field helps to be able to filter out any particulates or contaminants. We'll go over how it works here in a second. Whereas in that bottom right, you can be able to see these houses, they're connected to pipes, which connect closer to the street into a bigger pipe, and then it's shuttled off somewhere. So sewer is transported to a central location to be treated instead of on site at the house. And these typically they're treated by the city or the county. So typically you're billed by the city or the county. So a septic tank has specific advantages. One, it's actually a lot more environmentally friendly. You use a lot less water and you use a lot less energy or power to be able to naturally filter out your wastewater. Same thing, cost. There's no monthly sewer bill to the city or county. Typically, it's a one-time install, and as long as you're maintaining it very well, it can last a long time, even decades. Though try not to stretch it out that much. Some disadvantages, though, is that if things do break down or you're not very attentive to the maintenance, it could break down and it can be fairly expensive on having to redo an entire system or just the traditional upkeep. It also requires dedicated space on the property for not only the tank, but the drainage fields, and that can take up quite a bit of space. So if you don't have very much space, it may not be a very good solution. But let's go over what a septic tank is. So here it's just a picture. I'll try to describe it the very best that I can. Basically, it's a big concrete box split up into two sections. There's the acetylene tank and then as well a filter section. So these two compartments as well, they typically have holes at the very top so that anyone can be able to access both of these containers. These green circles right here are just lids. And so water flows in the inlet portion, very aptly named. That's water coming from the house. Water from the house goes in through the inlet and it immediately hits this T right here in the pipe. And that's very important. So what this is causing is it's causing the water to be able to hit it and stop. That's causing all the water to go straight down. So that whenever it's going straight down, any solid waste is going right down here to the bottom in sludge. The reason for that is you'll notice these two dividers, they're not divided completely. They're divided by, or there's a little gap in between them. In between this known as a baffle. And what this is to be able to help limit the amount of solid particulate that makes it through to the secondary area. Again, the whole purpose of this is so that the water can get through. Ultimately, some of this sludge here at the bottom, some of the heavier particulates, or scum up here at the top that might be resting on the top of the water, or lighter particulates, don't make it through to the other side. We can then be able to see that as the water moves through this little inlet into the secondary area, there's sometimes a filter there, but it connects to another T pipe so that the water has a better chance of only the water coming up through it and then moving towards the outlet. Again, the ultimate purpose of this is so that water is the only thing that's moving through this. Now, then it moves into the outlet, which then moves into the rest of the drainage field, which we'll go into that in 1 second. Ultimately, a septic system, it's important to be able to understand that it typically consists of three things. So that typically consists of the tank that we just went over, a drainage field, which we're going to go over the next slide, and the soil system around it. It's all three of these things together that ultimately make up a septic system. And so we just went over a tank. And if you want more specialty or more specialized knowledge, kind of better help understanding in the reading section, if you look up how the septic system works and the types of septic systems handout, those can be able to help better explain and even have some frequently asked questions, especially if you may have a septic system and want to better understand how does it work, what's the best way to be able to take care of it. It's also important that this tank, to be able to understand that it's sealed off. It's sealed off with purpose. That's because the primary agent, as you may ask yourself, is, Alex, what about all of that sludge down at the bottom? Won't that just build up over time and then get into the other area and then it's going to get out anyway? Well, yes and no. If you have too much or you overflow it or it's over capacity, sometimes you have to bring in someone who comes in and pumps out the top from these from this. They just get a large hose and it sucks out all the sludge that they can so your septic system can work. Otherwise, it could back up and it could clog and get all over the rest of your yard. Inside of this sludge, however, is an ecosystem very similar to even our gut, our inside of our stomach lining and our digestive tract. There's a whole biome of bacteria that's good. And we really appreciate them because they have a very good job of eating that sludge. It takes time, but it's anaerobic bacteria that digest those solid particles. So again, aerobic, just you can think of oxygen. And so aerobic, so like aerobic exercise, you're having to breathe a lot. Anaerobic means no oxygen. So this is bacteria that thrives in an environment that does not have a lot of oxygen. And so the container being sealed is very, very important because it helps that anaerobic bacteria flourish. As well as it's important to understand that they're very delicate as well. That's why strong drain cleaners and things of that nature, sometimes it's not the best. I mean, we still need to clean as far as our houses and make sure that our systems on our direct end are taken care of. But too much or too harsh of chemicals can actually damage that ecosystem within that tank and lead to further buildup of that sludge. But that's a little bit about septic systems. Again, it consists of three parts: the tank, which we just went over, drainage field, which we're going to go over right next, and the soil that's around it. And we'll describe that here in a little bit. So septic system drainage fields. Ultimately, it's the liquid waste, so the water that went through the tank and is now being distributed out into the soil around your environment and around your house. There's a lot of different ones in the handouts that I referenced before. They go over a lot of ones. Really focus on three types. There's different kinds of gravity systems, which utilize a septic tank, and it requires a distribution box so that the water can flow evenly. However, it typically requires, again, gravity so that the water can be able to go down. There's no pump house that causes extra energy to be able to move this water anywhere. So if your property has a natural decline, a gravity system may be able to work out just great. Then there's also a sand line trench. So this uses a septic tank and a pump tank so that it can be able to use some energy and push this water somewhere, and it pushes it through a sand-filled tank before it gets to the drainage field. And I have some pictures on the next slide to be able to help out with this as well, so we'll go over that. But the sand acts as a way of a filter, and that'll make a lot more sense. We're going to be referencing back to how sand filters wastewater quite a bit throughout this week. But the sand acts as a way of treating the waste before it even gets to the drainage fields. And then there's a mound. And a mound, it uses the same components as gravity and sand-lined system. So it uses a septic tank and a pump tank and sometimes even a sand filter. But then it gets to a mound. It's kind of a buildup of material that contains a whole network, a multitude of pipes that slowly disperse the water evenly throughout the area. And this is great for environments that have a very high clay content, because again, clay, it's not very permeable for water. However, if you have just very slow drips, it can be able to work with that. It's just going to slow down the rate at which water goes through. And as well, if you have a very high water table, because again, we don't want water flowing too fast, because if it flows too fast, then it might not filter all the way before it gets to the regular water supply. And now let's look at some pictures to better understand this. So up here in the top right, we have a gravity system. So we have a little house and it's working. The pipe goes straight down and then it goes, and it's kind of hard to tell. You can see from the landscape, it's kind of downhill from it. Just imagine it's going downhill a little bit steeper, I guess. But it goes from the house into a septic tank. That concrete box moves forward to another box. This is a distribution box. So this is what splits the water into 3 or multiple different ways into these various different tubes that stretch the entirety of an underground field. And in these tubes are small little holes that are drilled in with purpose. So as the water goes through the distribution, it filters out evenly throughout the different tubes, and then the water can drip through those holes evenly at an appropriate pace so that we can time it correctly. Because if at the very bottom, you can be able to see that's groundwater. We, again, don't want water to go too fast, and we don't want it to go too slow. It's a very delicate art. Up here at the top, this is an example of a sand-lined filter. So again, we have our house. It flows from the house into a septic tank, just like gravity, and then it goes into a pump tank. This just uses energy to be able to push the water through something. It's going to need a little more oomph than just gravity itself. And that's because it's going through a sand filter. This is how it's illustrated here, at least, is a box with multiple different tubes that pushes the water through sand. And the sand acts as the water is pushing past the sand, that larger particulates that might have come through the septic tank are now being caught in the sand so the water can flow down. That water then collects at the bottom and is pumped to the distribution drain field. Just like with gravity, it goes to a distribution box and it goes throughout these various different holes and these pipes, and it drains into the soil around it. Here at the bottom is an example of a mound. So imagine a house is right over here on the left, and the water goes straight over to the septic tank. So that's where, again, we have the baffles, there's the scum and the sludge and the water, and it connects through a pipe to a pump house. And so here's a pump just giving that water a little oomph so that it can be able to go into a system. And it's pumping this water into this kind of mound, this above ground situation or area that is designed with topsoil, with sands, and is very, very man-made and designed so that water is dripped through this before it goes into the soil itself. So again, a very, very positive thing is you'll notice that there's a sand fill and topsoil, is that you can be able to have this even if it's a high clay content because it's above ground. And it can be able to really help to give that water some extra time that it needs to filter through without overloading the rest of the system. So again, there's a few different ones that those handouts go over, but at the very least, know the difference between these 3 types of systems. So now let's go into the city sewer waste treatment centers. So I guarantee you've seen these. You possibly just didn't know what you were looking at, or you knew and you're really smart. But be sure to watch. There's two videos. They're both 25 minutes long. I apologize about that. But after you look at this, after you look at your own reading, it can provide a little bit more examples of what these things are. The biggest things I'm going to try to highlight and try to help you avoid getting dragged down into too much terminology. Some important things to be able to remember, though, whenever it comes to wastewater, the average person estimated produces roughly 125 gallons of wastewater per day. If you remember that exercise where you tracked your own wastewater output, how much water that you drank and everything like that, how much water you used, you may have been close. You may have went way above. You may have been really below. That's the wonderful thing about averages. But on average, 125 gallons of wastewater per day. You think of some of these cities with millions of people in it. These systems, these waste treatment systems, they're going to have to deal with a lot. And that's why they're here. And that's why typically you have to pay a monthly fee to upkeep this. It's very important. All city wastewater, all people that are involved with city wastewater, they're sent to a central waste treatment center, such as the illustrated above. And these, it's important to be able to understand, alternative to a septic tank. Septic tank is closed. It uses anaerobic bacteria. These typically use aerobic bacteria. Typically, aerobic bacteria are a little bit faster, and they typically operate a little bit faster as well. And so they can be able to help out with a lot of the turnover that this is going to achieve. But a lot of these steps within a waste treatment center are going to be promoting that aerobic or oxygen-liking bacteria. All right, I think it's thinking. Okay, good. So it's important to be able to understand that the treatment types that it goes through, there's three different types. There's primary, there's secondary, and there's tertiary. So not every waste treatment plant has all of these things, but you need some of each one. The primary reason is because each one, as it goes through primary to secondary to tertiary, is slowly filtering out more and more particulates. And that way it can be able to be a cleaner result at the bottom and therefore go back into the regular waste or regular water stream, and it'll be okay for future consumption and use. And so the typical flow is that it's filtering the largest objects first and the smallest objects last. And so again, you can think of the largest objects, it's filtering out literal poop. And then at the smallest things, it's trying to sometimes get rid of bacteria before it gets through it. So primary options, and again, we'll try to be able to describe it a little bit with these pictures, but then I have more pictures afterwards. And the most important thing as well is at least understanding where each of these things fit. Is it a primary, is it secondary, or is it tertiary? Because it's important to be able to distinguish all three of them, just because they help better understand what tool are you utilizing to help clean the water in the system. So you don't have to really memorize like how these things work or anything like that, but just at least memorize primary, secondary, tertiary, which of these objects fit into which one. So primary, this includes pre-filters, barrel screens, primary settling tank, and scrapers. So we can be able to follow this as far as the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in this picture up here and above. So water enters into a pump station typically. It's going to need a lot of energy to move throughout all of these different systems. And the first place it goes to is a bar screen. And so let's look at the bar screen. So primary treatment, two different types. Pre-filters, primary settling tank. So right here on the left, this picture is a barrel screen. Bar screen is very, very similar. Basically, how it operates is that water goes through or into this barrel, and it's constantly turning and it's constantly churning. There's these holes in it, and they're kind of big holes because, again, primary treatment is to be able to get those large objects that may be within the water stream. as it's turning and as it's rotating, water is able to drain out the bottom, but up here at the top, it's able to collect some of the heavier, some of the bigger objects that are there. And that is a barrel screen. Very similar over here on the right, this is a primary settling tank. You can think it's just a big open tank that has a little sweeper here on the bottom. And you'll notice that there's no sweeper on the top. That's important. There's only a sweeper here on the bottom, and that's what's known as a scraper. So as water gets pumped into this settling tank, all naturally, the heavier objects are going to filter from the lighter objects. As the heavier objects, again, the biggest objects, float down to the bottom, these arms sweep across, collect it, and then take it away and remove it from the area. Anytime that we remove any of these substances during one of these treatment processes, that's referred to as sludge. And you'll notice in one of the documents, it illustrates that sludge to digesters, and it doesn't give any context. I don't know why they decided to do that. But it's stating that whenever it goes through a treatment process, it creates sludge, solid waste. And that solid waste goes to a digester, goes to some sort of alternate system, whether it's a drying bed or it turns into activated sludge. Basically, it's taken away from the process so that water and the smaller particulates can be able to move through to the next treatment process. Just if you saw sludge to digesters, that's all it means, is it's removing the sludge and it's getting rid of the sludge in a completely separate process. Okay, so that was primary treatment. So right here, we can be able to see that the water came through the barrel, or this one is more like a bar screen here on 2, and then it moves into 3. It's kind of a settling tank. You can be able to see that all of the sludge is moving here from the bottom in this brown line and getting pumped into just a regular truck so they can be hauled away somewhere else. And then we get into right over here, 4 and 5, and as well 6. And so 4, 5, and 6, that includes different items such as a trickling filter, aeration oxidation ditch, clarifiers, activated sludge, or a stabilization pond. So let's go and let's look at all 3 of those, or all of those, try to be able to better understand what they are. So secondary treatment. So what it is again, it's understanding that it's important to be able to understand that a waste treatment center typically has very large basins of water, very, very high tanks, very, very big. And they use aerobic bacteria, or this constant churning, getting water and getting air into the water to be able to help promote that bacteria to be able to eat and digest all this solid waste and any sort of other particulates that might be in the water. So right here, we can be able to see a trickling filter. That's right here in the bottom right. Basically, it looks like that big basin. However, there's arms up the top and they're rotating. And what this is that it's spitting out water. It's trickling water as it spins around. This has one really big function. It's that because it's very small and it's churning up the water a little bit, it is making the water oxygen rich and very oxygen rich, so that, again, the bacteria can be able to have the oxygen it needs to keep munching. Then we have an aeration or oxidation ditch. And again, a waste treatment plant doesn't need all of these, but typically has a few of these to be able to accomplish its function. Up here in the top left, we can be able to see this is an aeration or oxidation ditch. Basically, it's using an air compressor or using a pump to be able to physically push air into the tank so that bubbles can be able to go around, it can be able to excite that bacteria, and water can naturally filter through into a settling tank before it's moved on into another process. Then we sometimes as well have a clarifier. So a clarifier is very similar to a settling tank. Again, that big round one. However, it has an arm on the bottom, just like the settling tank, and it also has an arm at the top. You can be able to see this is the bottom left picture. So there's the arm on the bottom, and there's the arm on the top, and it's constantly spinning around very slowly. As water gets pushed into this, it's separating again. Heaviest things go to the bottom, lightest things go to the top. The things that go up to the top is otherwise known as floc, Flocc, in a term known as flocculation. So then we also have the heavier objects go to the bottom in a term we know as sedimentation. So in a clarifier, flocculation and sedimentation occur, and these arms constantly are spinning around to be able to collect and to push that sludge out of it so that the water can continue on through the treatment center. Activated sludge is another way of saying that the sludge is being recycled and it's being collected so that any good bacteria in it is still able to be utilized, so that we're not constantly have to rebuild colonies. Up here at the top right, it kind of illustrates this. Raw water is coming in, goes into an aeration tank, the clarifier and settler. It's separating out, again, the heavier particulates and the rest of the water. Treated water keeps on going, and the sludge that gets taken off, it either goes into the waste or it's activated and it gets recycled. It gets put back into the system because that bacteria is still good and we want to try to utilize it the best we can. Then sometimes there's a stabilization pond. Stabilization pond, you can think of it, it's like the primary settling tank, but you do it again. And so it's that natural settling that we're trying to accomplish to further filter out any large particulates that may be present. So by this time, we've already gone through and we've taken out the biggest particles. We've taken out some of the medium and also the small particles. Now we got to get to the very, very small particles. And so that's where tertiary treatment comes into play. So you can either use gravity to filter through a substance and perform sand filtration or carbon bed filtration, or you can use disinfection, and it's ozone or UV lamps. And typically, again, sometimes you don't just have one, you have multiple of these. You might have a sand filtration and ozone, or sand filtration, ozone, and UV. It just depends on what ultimately is able to get you that quality water at the end. And so the sand filtration, it's just like with the septic tank. Water is pushed through, and it's up here in this top left picture. Water is put through into kind of another tank. And as it tries to drip down and tries to follow gravity downwards, it is going through fine sand and also gravel pebbles. As it's going through this, the sand is naturally taking out some of those smaller particulates that weren't otherwise gotten, as well as the gravel, until it can be able to go into this drain pipe and then go out into the rest of the process. A carbon bed filtration operates a very similar way. This bottom picture just shows the water's pumped in, the water travels through with gravity or through a pump through different layers, slowly getting different particulates until it's drained out the bottom so that it can continue on the process. That's it. In fact, if you have like a pure or a Brita filter, as far as one of the pouring ones or the ones that go into your fridge, typically it operates in a very similar way. You put water up in the top, and then you'll notice that it's just drip, 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 dripping down at the bottom very slowly. You get a new filter, it actually drips, and we have one, and whenever we fill it up, it's already gone through the entire filter in about like 2 or 3 minutes. But as time goes on, we have to replace it like every 2 to 3 months. As time goes on, sometimes it could take even closer to 10, 20, even 30 minutes to be able to go through the filter. It's because it's naturally clogging up, and therefore it's not filtering as well. Then we go into the smallest particulates. Really not even particulates. A lot of this time we're looking at bacteria, viruses, parasites that may be still present within the water that was not captured by any filter. That's what the purpose of ozone or UV lamps or disinfection is. Up here in the top right, this is an example of UV lamps. I toured a waste treatment center. I believe it's the one that there's either a video or a document for the Rexburg Waste Treatment Center. I toured that actually, and they possess UV lamps. You wouldn't even notice it either. It's all the water is rushing underneath our feet inside of this building, and then there's just a bright light. under, like, at our feet. And that's just constant UV lights that are shining on the water, killing those viruses, bacteria, some parasites that may be present before ultimately it's released into the regular water stream. But one of the big things is, again, you don't have to know how each one works or what each one looks like. I could care less about that. But it is important to be able to understand which of these is primary, secondary, and tertiary, because that helps illustrate which one is it trying to filter. Is it the large particulates? Is it the very small particulates? Which one are we looking at? But definitely good luck. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. I'm here to help ultimately, and hope you have a great rest of your week, or you make the week great. All right.